We'll be discussing the business of Indian agriculture, land use management. Today we'll be using the GoToWebinar system, so you'll see a questions and chat box feature, which feel free to type into. We'll also be having interactive polls throughout the webinar where you'll be able to choose multiple choice answers and then see how the rest of the group answers the poll. I'd like to turn it over to Linnell Smith now.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Janice. Hi, Kehal. We are still waiting on a couple more people. Unfortunately, Angie's not going to be able to join us today, but we'll go ahead and get started because we want to make sure that we're cognizant of your time. We do have a 1-hour webinar, and we want to make sure we have enough time for John as well. But I just wanted to welcome you guys and kind of go over why we are doing the second webinar for our first year of our grant year. So you guys are all part of the ANAC's partnership project as a recipient. So this is a 5-year grant, and as you guys are all aware, you receive $20,000 each year from the ANA grant. $10,000 of that is in kind and expected towards the project from your organization. We also, through AWISTA, are providing 40 hours of TA based on the TA plan, and that was shared with all of the executive directors or assigned staff. So we do have our first year's TA plan, and I believe we have all of our site visits scheduled. So we'll implement the 40 hours, and then we're also going to do 1 day of back office services. So we have that plan in process right now. So we're going to kind of detail that out over the next week or two. And then, of course, you also receive travel stipends to the trainings that we expect you to participate in. And then just your yearly expectations to participate in 2 webinars. The first one was really to kick off the grant season back in, I believe it was December of last year. So this is our second webinar, and it's if you refer back to your contract, you are required to participate in at least 2 webinars a year. So this is going to satisfy the second webinar for this first grant year. You're also required to complete biannual reports. We finished our first one in April. Once our first grant year is over, we're going to initiate that in October as well. And so part of being a partner through the ANA Seeds, you'll participate in the Indianpreneurship Train the Trainer and Business of Indian Ag Train the Trainer. And that was all in year 1. So when we had the ANA convening back in April, you completed that requirement for year 1. So next year, during the ANA convening, more than likely we'll have the Native Artist Train the Trainer. And then through year 3 and 5, we'll hit additional topics for the TA. And then most importantly, the tracking and reporting obligations. So our biannual reports will include job creation numbers, number of small business loans, small business clients whom you provided TA to, and then we want to track the Native-owned businesses developed, and then any new capital that you've brought into the organization for your loan fund. And then training is hosted for the Native entrepreneurs, and then, of course, the in-kind documentation through the letters of the services that you're providing as a match or in-kind services. So those are the basic requirements, and that was just really a refresher as to why we're doing this and why we're having the second webinar. So, of course, if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat box as well. But I will go ahead and hand it off to John Phillips, who will be going through the Indian agriculture webinar today. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thanks, Linnell. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to visit with us today. What we're going to try to accomplish in the next, 45 minutes or so is talk about land use and management in a Native American perspective. So let me introduce myself. I'm the Executive Director of First Americans Land Grant Consortium. We work with tribal colleges and universities around the country, providing technical assistance and training services to them. And in recent years, we've been really focusing on providing outreach to Native American farmers and ranchers. And we entered into a partnership with First Nations Development Institute and AWISTA a number of years ago to develop a curriculum and to provide this sort of outreach to either Native producers or to folks that work with Native producers. So today's webinar is sort of an outgrowth of that. So today, let me say, if you have any questions along the way, just put it in the chat room, and Stephanie's going to monitor that, and I'll pause and try to answer your questions as best as I can. So feel free to do that throughout the webinar. As I mentioned, the content that we're going to go through is based on the Business of Indian Agriculture. It's a curriculum that was developed in 2012 in partnership with Falcon and First Nations Land Grant Institute. What we're going to try to accomplish today is three things. One is better understand the general considerations of land use and management practices. Secondly, understand land use and management issues that are specific to the Native American context. And then finally, to understand how whole farm planning can be used as a tool for effective land use and management. Okay, so first slide is that we want to talk a little bit about the history and traditions of Native American land use and management. And as probably everybody knows, Native Americans have had a long and close relationship with the land. And this history and relationship is really important to know because it forms the basis of many of the land use and management issues that we all face today. Contrary to some of the stereotypes of Native Americans that people think they left no mark on the land, in fact, tribal communities have used sophisticated natural resource, land use, and land management techniques to make the best use of their environments throughout history. And while we want to be careful when we generalize across tribes, there are, I believe, some basic traditional Native American land use and management principles that we could describe. And those include that land use and management practices were developed from experience gained through long periods of careful observation and trial and error, and that land use and management practices strive for maximum sustainable yield, and I underline the word sustainable there, instead of just maximum production. And finally, land use and management practices often respect the balance and connection between the natural and spiritual worlds. So each tribe has its own unique history and traditions associated with its land, and the particular land use and management issues for you will depend on the land's geology, the climate, the wildlife and plant life, the economic opportunities, as well as the cultural and social and spiritual considerations of the tribe. Okay, next slide. So basic considerations of Native American land use and management. Whether you already own your land or inheriting land or purchasing or leasing land use and management is going to be the, if not the, but definitely a major consideration for your agribusiness. And how you use and manage that land is going to, in large ways, determine the success of your business. So just because something, land has always been used and managed in a certain way, doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider the basic questions of how the land can best be used and managed. For example, changes over time in ag technologies, plant and animal breeding, the economy, land planning and zoning policies, and even climate change can alter the way that the land is best used and managed today. And so there are a lot of factors that can influence how your land is used and managed. First of all, there's the physical and natural properties of the land, and they play an important role in determining how it's going to be used and managed. The soil types, the climate, the terrain are all going to help determine how and what kind of agricultural crops and livestock can be supported. So for example, one reason that about 2/3 of Montana's agricultural land is grazed is because there's not enough rainfall to support crops. So for most, at least in 2/3 of the cases in Montana, crops would not be an appropriate use for the ag land there. The types of crop varieties and livestock breeds that are available and suitable for the land are also going to help determine how you use your land and manage it. And then ag technologies and production techniques that have been developed are also going to be important to consider. And remember, just because there's some new advanced technology or technique available, it might still be too expensive for you or impractical for your agribusiness. then also the marketplace, the ag marketplace, is going to determine what can be economically sustained by the land. So, for instance, a particular crop might grow well on your land, but if you can't make money with that crop, if it's not economically valuable, then that's probably not a good use for your business. Of course, there might be good non-economical reasons for growing a particular crop, so we also want to think of that. Land use planning and zoning policies passed by local governments can play a role in how land can be used and managed. And then finally, remember that farming and ranching is much more than just what we call cows and plows or raising crops and livestock. Your operations can include firewood production, feed manufacturing, agritourism, fruit and vegetable stands, slaughterhouses, retail sales, and many other types of ag-related activities. So you want to think broadly about those potential uses when you're thinking about how you want to use and manage your land. Okay, so one of your first steps in land use and management planning is to assess the land in terms of its what we call agricultural potential. And so there are lots of land assessment tools that you can use, and probably the best thing to do is touch base with your USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. That's NRCS. They're state-based, and there's an NRCS person in most counties, and they can help you figure out the best tool for you. I'm going to mention NRCS several times throughout this webinar as probably one of the first people you want to visit with if you're thinking about managing new lands and in different ways. So after you assess the land in terms of its ag potential, the next step is to become familiar with the local planning and zoning policies that may affect your land. So these are laws and regulations that could be associated with city, county, state, and tribal government entities. And they can determine whether you're even allowed to use your land in agriculture. If your land is Indian trust land or within Indian reservation boundaries, then there's going to be additional regulatory considerations that you need to check with your local tribe and with the BIA. And additionally, there might be cultural or spiritual considerations that you also need to be aware of. Another important thing to consider in land use and management is conservation. Most farmers and ranchers understand and appreciate the need to protect the natural resources, so the land's going to continue to support them and future generations. And there's a range of conservation practices and programs that have been developed to assist farmers and ranchers in managing their natural resources in a sustainable way. And so NRCS, again, is a good agency to work with on those conservation programs. USDA's Farm Service Agency, that's FSA, also offers some conservation assistance programs. And FSA, like NRCS, are locally based. There's going to be a local USDA service center in your county, and they'll be, able to assist you in that area. In some areas, tribes have developed what are called conservation districts that are formed to support the tribe's efforts to protect and use and conserve their reservation lands. So in these cases, then the conservation district could provide assistance to landowners and users in using their land and natural resources in a sustainable way. Okay, we want to talk a little bit about respecting cultural and sacred sites, because this is a very, very important issue when dealing with land on Indian reservations, or even in some cases off reservation. As we mentioned earlier, Native Americans have this deep historical relationship to the land, and that often involves a balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. And so, for example, many of the creation stories that tribes tell involve how people originated from the earth and the landscape. And in some cases, these stories involve specific locations. Also, over time, many sites on the land took on special significance for the tribe because there were important historical or cultural or spiritual events that took place at those locations. And these spiritual and cultural meanings at these sites are just as important as the spiritual significance of sites held by other religions and cultures around the world. So, for instance, in many societies, churches, mosques, synagogues, and cemeteries are considered as sacred sites, and so these Native American sacred sites should be treated in the same manner. So sacred sites could be viewed as part of the guarantee of the freedom of religion that's established in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it's also protected under the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act, which states that it's the policy of the U.S. to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise traditional religions, not limited to, including but not limited to, sites. Sorry, my clicker is not working as it should. Here we go. Next slide. So for the agribusiness owner or the leasehold holder, showing respect for Native American cultural and sacred sites can mean several things from a practical aspect. First, you want to remember that farm planning balances family, environmental, and community goals along with your business production goals. So when you're thinking of your community and its social goals or values, you want to be thinking about being a good neighbor and living in harmony with your community's values. And so maintaining good tribal relations isn't only the right thing to do, it's good for your business too. The next, you want to learn about the potential for sacred and cultural sites on your land. And because many locations of sacred sites are kept confidential to discourage desecration, this might be a sensitive task. And your first step should be to consult with your local tribes. Many tribes have a cultural preservation office or a tribal historic preservation office, and those offices often research and map and manage these cultural and sacred sites. And if a tribe doesn't have one of those offices, then you should consult with their maybe tribal lands management department or some similar tribal entity. If you do find that there are cultural or sacred sites on your land, then you should consider the following. First, if the site's not already widely known, you should keep the location of the site confidential. Making its location public might only encourage unwelcome attention for both you and the tribe. Secondly, you should learn more about the cultural and spiritual history and meaning of the site, and you might be surprised and excited to learn about the importance of the location to the history of the tribe. Gaining knowledge about the site is going to help you have respect for it, as well as provide a better base for your decisions on what to do about the site. Third, you don't want to desecrate the site in any way by removing objects or altering the site. Taking pictures or making drawings might not be acceptable to the tribe, so you want to definitely check with your local tribal cultural expert if you have any questions about that. If the site's located within productive ag land, then you might consider changing your farm practices to work around that specific location. And then fourth, to the extent possible, you don't want to deny access to those who have a spiritual or a cultural reason for visiting the site. You can work with visitors to accommodate their spiritual and cultural practices, and oftentimes these visits need to occur during specific times of the year. Finally, you want to work with the tribe to develop what we call a co-management plan for the site that ensures that both your interests and the tribe's interests are protected, and that sets up a set of policies and procedures in place for dealing with any issues that might come up. Okay, next slide is about natural properties and the appropriate agricultural uses of land. Agriculture is often defined as the controlled management of living things, living organisms, but mostly plants and animals, to produce food, fiber, and other products for human use. And if you think of the raw inputs to the agricultural endeavor, they're physical, they're chemical, biological, and climatic, and they include such things as soils, moisture, sunlight, and heat, and the plants and animals and biological organisms that reside on the land. So when we talk about land, we're often usually talking about some sort of physical territory or property, but when we're discussing it in terms of an agricultural sense, the land encompasses all of the natural elements that interact with the land to potentially support agriculture. So therefore, it does include soils, moisture, sun, plants, and so forth. On the soils, it includes the chemical and physical properties, the terrain, and the way the climate has an effect on the land, the plants, the animals, the organisms that live on the land. And the first step in figuring out the best use of your land is to know its basic properties, these basic natural properties. So let's start with your soil. Think of your soils as the kind of basic building block for your agricultural operation. Before deciding on what you're going to do, or maybe even whether you're going to buy the land or acquire the land, you need to consider what the soils will support. So that means knowing your soil type, its structure, and its texture. For instance, is it a sandy soil? Is it a clay soil? Its depth, its drainage, its slope, its suitability for various agriculture or building uses. And fortunately, most of this work has been done for you. It's been gathered throughout the U.S. through these soil surveys, and it's documented in soil survey maps and is relatively easily accessible. There's a web-based resource called the Web Soil Survey, WSS, Web Soil Survey. And if you just Google on that, you can basically go right to your piece of land and pull up the soil map for that area. It's operated by USDA's NRCS, and it'll provide all that information about soils that I just mentioned. If you don't or can't use that web-based soil survey, then you can just call your local NRCS office and ask for the soil survey for your land area, and they have that. The next step in knowing your soil is about learning its potential agricultural productivity in terms of its properties. And so this includes things like its pH, which is its relative acidity, and its fertility, which includes nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, its water holding capacity, and so forth. And you find this out using a soil test. So again, you can contact your local university land grant extension office or your local NRCS office to figure out how to get a local soil test done. They're very easy to do, and they don't cost much money. But remember that soils can change even in a relatively small land area. So you want to be sure to take soil samples wherever you think that the soil is going to change on you or vary on you. Okay, next it's time to consider the climate. It usually consists of influences from sunlight, temperature, precipitation, and wind. And there's two scales of climate to consider, macroclimate and microclimate. So macroclimates are those weather and long-term patterns that occur on a regional scale, and they include such things as the typical weather fronts and storm patterns that come through your area, the prevailing winds, the seasonal temperatures, and daylight changes. So, you know, it's hot in the summer, it's cold in the winter, it rains in the winter, it's dry in the summer, those kind of macro level weather patterns. On the other hand, microclimates are those weather patterns that are affected by your local land area, and they can include influences such as hillsides, shelter belts, tree shade patterns, frost pockets, and waterways. And these microclimates are important to know too, because they can vary considerably from your macroclimate weather pattern. And the best way to collect your microclimate data is basically just to carefully record the weather patterns that you see on your land and build up your own database. If you're looking at a piece of land to buy or to acquire, then you might want to interview the previous landowner or talk to nearby neighbors to learn about the local microclimate weather patterns there. And that's really important because that's going to tell you issues about, you know, how much you may need to irrigate and what soil, what crops or livestock might be able to be supported on that piece of land. Okay, next it's time to consider the biological profile of your land. So in other words, what plants, animals, insects, and microorganisms does the land currently support? And the answers to these questions are going to give you strong signals as to the appropriate use and management strategies for your land. So what plant life currently exists on your land? So if the plant's already in ag use, then the current cropping pattern is going to provide you with valuable data in terms of the productivity of the land, its yield, its water use, its nutrient uptake. It's also going to tell you about any pest or weed concerns and how you might want to till the soil and conserve the soil and so forth. On the other hand, if the land is not in ag production, then the current plant community will show you what natural processes have selected. So that'll give you a big hint as to what the land will support. And while you might be able to alter the landscape to meet some agricultural need that you might have or want, keep in mind that the greater you alter the land from its natural state, the more intensive the management effort will take and the more potential challenges you might have. So for example, if your natural plant community is described as semi-arid shortgrass prairie, then you know you're not going to want to grow rice on that piece of land, which is something that requires a lot of water management. The other thing you want to look at is what animal life is present on your land, and you want to consider how the current animal population is going to affect any ag operations, and in turn, how any ag operations are going to affect animal life. So, for example, wildlife can be both a blessing and a curse to an ag operation. It provides opportunities for instance, recreational activities and tourism revenue, such as hunting and maybe bird watching. But other wildlife, which is sometimes called nuisance wildlife, can create challenges for an ag operation, like deer or birds or prairie dogs, for instance. And again, just like before, to the extent possible, you want to work with the land's wildlife instead of against it, which will make your ag management job much, much easier. The soil's biology is another important consideration. The organisms that live in the soil are critical to its quality, and they affect the soil structure, and they're going to in turn affect soil erosion and water availability. And so you can protect your crops from pests and diseases with good soil microorganism control, and they're central to decomposition and nutrient cycling, which can affect your plant growth. So you want to check with your USDA specialists, and they can have a soil biology test performed to figure out what soil microorganisms you have and how they can work for you. Finally, you might want to consider what's called a biological assessment, and that provides general information on the potential presence of endangered species or sensitive habitats on your land. And while endangered species or sensitive habitat is often viewed as an unwelcome challenge to an ag producer, we always say it's better to be forewarned than to be surprised. So if you're looking at some potential land or looking to make a change in some land, that might be worth your effort. Okay, so let me pause right there and take a poll and see how we're doing. So we're going to try a little quiz here. And I'll ask the question, and there's 4 choices. There we go. Thanks, Stephanie. So what are the 4 major ingredients or inputs to the agricultural endeavor? Remember those 4 basic ingredients that interact with the land? So choice A is soils, farm equipment, plants, and water. Choice B, or second choice, soils, moisture, sun, and plants, animals, organisms. Third choice, soils, financial credit, farm equipment, and seeds. Fourth choice, water, sun, plants, and hard work. So I'll just pause there and let you weigh in, and then we'll see what you think. Okay, so it looks like 75% of you chose the soils, moisture, sun, plants, animals, and organisms. That's the correct answer. 25% said soils, farm equipment, plants, and water. That was close. The farm equipment is not the essential major ingredient in input. It is an important input at some point down the road, but not right here at this point. Okay, good job. Next question. Which of the following are agencies to consider for help in soil mapping and soil testing? I mentioned them on several occasions. Your choices are USDA Farm Service Agency, local and/or agricultural banks, USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, the Farm Union, or all of the above. Okay, and the answer is? Okay, 50-50, Farm Service Agency and NRCS. The answer is NRCS. They are going to do the soils testing and the soils mapping for you. FSA has a conservation program that's available, several conservation programs, but most of what they do is provide grants and farm loans and credit. So NRCS was the correct answer. Okay, great job. All right, we're going to move forward. And as before, if you have any questions, just throw it in the chat box and we'll take care of it. We're going to talk about land demarcation, mapping, and surveying. And this is important because really, if you think about it, the most fundamental question concerning the ownership of a parcel of land is its demarcation, which is where exactly is it and how much land is there. And so first thing is you need to know where to look for the legal description of the land. Often a deed is what you need, and that describes with reasonable certainty the land that's being identified. But its description doesn't need to require technical terms to be used. So land boundaries can be identified in deeds by plat locations, in latitude and longitude degrees, or in distances known from some known location. Typically, if you're a non-Indian landowner or an Indian landowner with fee simple land, then your county's Recorder of Deeds office is going to record and maintain for permanent record all those documents related to real estate. And your deed will give you the legal description of the land, but you'll need a surveyor to use that information to precisely locate your property lines or to find or place stakes or other markers along your property. Fee simple land ownership is typically the most complete and absolute form of land ownership. It provides the owner with full rights to sell or pass land to another by a will or inheritance. On the other hand, Indian trust land ownership is based on the General Allotment Act of 1887, which transferred legal title of Indian lands to the federal government. And Indian nations and landowners retain what they call beneficial use of the land, which means they can use it and earn income from the land and transfer ownership interests to their heirs. So for Indian landowners who own land in trust, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of the Special Trustee for American Indians, that's OST, is going to be responsible for recording and storing and providing access to information about how much land you own and where it's located. Mapping is especially useful to farmers and ranchers in planning their operations and managing their land. And so boundary maps are good for locating any easements or land use restrictions, and then field maps can help in managing and coordinating your crop or livestock operations. Farm maps should include buildings and facilities, waterways, fence lines, and any sensitive ecological areas. So to develop a farm map, you basically need a base map, which is going to use some existing aerial or topographic map, and then you customize it for your needs. So probably one of the easiest way to do this is go to Google Earth. If you've ever used that tool, it's free and it's on the web. You simply go to google.com/earth, and you download the latest version, and then you can navigate to your exact area of interest. And then once you have it, there's a customized map feature where you can, layer on your particular farm and field and boundary information. Google Maps is also similar, and you can use that as well. Same sort of thing. You go to Google Maps, and you find your piece of land, and then there's a customized map feature where you can add on your information. There's also other web-based and computer tools that you can buy that would allow you to do your own custom maps. And in any case, whatever you use, you want to add your unique farm features, property lines, fence lines, roads, waterways, and other important natural features, such as valleys or cliffs. Then you want to include your home and your farm buildings and storage units and so forth. You can also use layers, map layers, to separate your features into categories, such as boundaries or water and natural features, buildings, and then crops, and so forth. And then those map layers are supported by GIS systems, which allow you to create customized maps based on what you're trying to do. So it's a pretty handy way of managing your land using mapping. Finally, land surveying is a highly skilled profession. You should only need it when some precise and maybe legally valid land positions are required. And a person has to be licensed as a surveyor to establish any property line. And if you're using surveying for building purposes, you also want somebody that's licensed and capable. Okay, next slide. We're going to start talking about sustainable agricultural management practices. Sustainable ag is very much in line with traditional native farming and land use techniques that we started this webinar with. So, any consideration of land use and management needs to talk about sustainability. I don't think anybody would argue the point that preserving your farm and your natural resources for future generations is not a worthwhile thing. Unfortunately, sometimes sustainability has been used as a way to judge other people on how they manage their land, and I really like to stay away from that and just look at it as a constructive way to talk about benefits and costs to an ag operation and to its environment and to future generations of farmers and ranchers. So the term sustainable ag has been defined a lot of ways, but we like to use the definition from the 1990 Farm Bill, which says it's an integrated system of plant and animal production practices having a site-specific application that will, over the long term, satisfy human food and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality and the natural resource base, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources, and integrate where appropriate natural biological cycles and controls, sustain the economic viability of farm operations, and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. In practice, what this means is some of the following things. Rotating crops to help prevent weeds, diseases, insects, and other pest problems, using alternative sources of soil nitrogen, which means alternatives to chemical fertilizers, reducing soil erosion, reducing water contamination by ag chemicals, controlling pests with strategies that don't harm the natural environment or people, increasing mechanical biological weed control instead of spraying pesticides or herbicides, using soil and water conservation practices, using animal and green manures, using inputs in a way that doesn't harm plants or animals or people, and so forth. Of course, with all of these, there's costs and benefits associated with every one of those practices. So, for example, if you adopt a low or no-till practice, it may conserve the soil but add costs for weed control and new machinery, but might also save you fuel costs and, like I said, reduce soil erosion. So you have to weigh the costs and benefits of everything, and you should also evaluate them both in the short term and long term. So, for example, with the no-till practice, you might have short-term costs like increased weed control, but they could produce longer-term benefits like conserving productive soil that can't be replaced. Likewise, some no-till short-term benefits like reducing fuel use could produce larger long-term costs like have ongoing pest and disease problems. So a good resource for if you're thinking about sustainable ag practices, a good resource is USDA's Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education program, which is called SARE, S-A-R-E, and it's organized by regions, and each region has its own assistance program. So if you Google SARE, USDA SARE, you'll be able to find what's available in your area. When you're talking about sustainable ag, oftentimes organic agriculture is mentioned in sort of the same breath. And while they often go hand in hand, they're not strictly speaking the same thing. So you can have organic practices that aren't sustainable, and you can have sustainable practices that aren't organic. Also, oftentimes you'll hear about the local food movement, which has been a part of the sustainable ag discussion. And it's, you know, the term local foods isn't really clearly defined, but generally speaking, it's about foods that are produced within a close geographic region. Their production is considered as a way to strengthen the local food systems, which provides local economic benefits. It reduces transportation and shipping costs, and it strengthens a community's resilience against disruptions in the food supply chain. So, so all of this is to say that sustainable ag isn't a one-size-fits-all deal. Your particular farm or ranch is unique, and the sustainable ag practices that are going to work for you are going to be unique to your situation. So don't think of it as a goal to achieve, like you're dieting to lose weight, but think of it as a way of living and working, which would be more like eating more healthy and exercising more often. Okay, along with sustainable ag is a method of planning called whole farm planning. And whole farm planning is a process that takes a holistic view of the farm and incorporates various needs of the agribusiness, which includes the family, the community, and the environment into a single integrated plan. And it was developed in large part because of the limitations to the single-purpose farm plans that often created problems for farm families. So, for example, some farms might have had a real aggressive crop management strategy, which means they're just trying to grow as much as they possibly can. But when they did that, they damaged their soil, and they created problems for soil conservation. Or another example is maybe a farm had an ag business plan that demanded long working hours, which conflicted with the family's values and goals of spending more time together. So the point is that the ag operator shouldn't view any of these elements, natural resources, land, separate from other parties of the business, the family, and the community. So let's go through an example of a whole farm planning resource assessment. So this is an assessment that would help you kind of go through a planning process that would help the producer understand the farm resource strengths and weaknesses from all stakeholder perspectives. So here's a typical example. This is pretty simple, but it helps make the point. This is a whole farm planning resource assessment. Across the top, you have 4 columns. You have natural resources, infrastructure, people, and financial. And across the rows, you have strengths and weaknesses. So in this particular instance, this farm operation found that they have as a strength productive, arable soil and abundant wildlife, but their weakness is poor annual rainfall and high wind area, which means soil erosion. In terms of infrastructure, their strengths were farm buildings and equipment were in good shape, and they had a water well and pipes that were in good condition, so they had irrigation. But their weakness is their farmhouse was in bad condition. In terms of people, their strengths were they had the principal operator was experienced and highly skilled, and they had hired good workers and who were experienced and reliable. But the weakness is that the principal operator was close to retirement, and the younger members of the family weren't interested in keeping up in the farming business. Financially, the strengths were they had a positive cash flow, steady profit, good credit standing, and low debt. Their weakness was low savings for either emergencies or retirement. So once you lay that out, then you can see the balance and all the various perspectives in making your decision. And to put it another way, if you just looked at the financial situation and you said, wow, we're in great shape, but we have no savings, no for emergencies, no rainy day fund, no retirement, you might think, well, let's ramp up. Let's take on some debt, and let's expand the operation and improve profits and build up some savings. However, if you look over at people, you realize that this person's close to retirement and the younger family is not interested, so maybe ramping up is not a good idea. Maybe what you want to be doing is scaling down or selling off parts of it and liquidating some assets and transferring that to savings. Or, you look at the infrastructure and you see the farm is in poor shape, the farmhouse is in poor shape. So maybe, you're talking about succession planning and selling the farm and looking to build a retirement somewhere else. So this is a good example of how you have to balance all of these things in order to make a good decision for you, your family, the farm, and the environment. Okay, so we're going to go to general considerations of land transactions. And so basically there's essentially three things you can do with land. You can either lease or rent land to others, or you can lease, rent land from others, or you can buy or sell it, or you either inherit it from your family or you bequeath it to your family. And in each of these situations, you're going to assume a legal role with a whole set of financial and contractual rights, obligations, and responsibilities. And it is absolutely critical that you understand the legal aspects of these land transactions so you can protect yourself and your interests and fulfill your obligations. You should always consult with a professional legal and or real estate advisor before conducting any land transaction. So let's go through the three major types of transactions. First, leasing or renting land can be a pretty effective way to manage your ag business. And as you know, renting is typically a month-to-month agreement, and leasing is usually for a fixed term, typically in years. Leasing or renting can generate steady sources of income. It can, if you rent from someone else, it can give your business access to land that it doesn't have currently, and you can avoid large amounts of debts and fixed assets that land ownership might involve. It of course assumes that you've made a careful decision to lease or rent versus buy or sell. And when you make that decision of buy versus rent, you should use budget projections on the costs and returns and cash flows of both scenarios, and you should look at best cases versus worst case scenarios for each option. Of course, land prices are going to, be involved in that planning, and you're going to want to look at long-term planning versus short-term planning. And remember, with leasing, there's always the risk that at some point the lease might not be renewed for whatever reason. Also remember that laws are going to vary from tribe to tribe and from state to state, so you're going to want to work with a local legal expert to understand your specific rights and liabilities in any sort of lease rental agreement. Okay, secondly, there's the purchase or sell land option. And, strictly speaking, buying or selling land should be a financial decision that's based on the needs of the business and the land's productivity, its market value, interest rates, cash flow considerations, and so forth. And once the business need's been established, then it's simply a math issue to look at whether the buyer has enough money for a down payment and enough cash flow to make regular payments. And a lot of these decisions are similar to the ones you'd make when you're deciding to buy or rent land. But remember, land is not just financial in nature. It holds other values for people, including cultural and family connections, environmental interests, and emotional and spiritual ties. So these values are important to consider whenever you're thinking about buying or selling land. And again, that whole farm planning is a good tool to use in deciding whether you're ready or wanting to buy or sell land or rent or lease land. Finally, if the land is trust land, Indian trust land, then there's a whole other set of administrative and regulatory issues that you have to take into account, such as appraising the land, applying for the sale of the land, retaining your mineral rights, and so forth. Okay, third is the inheritance piece, which can be either planned, you hope, or it could be, unfortunately, an unplanned event. And there are many serious considerations about land inheritance, such as estate taxes, wills, trusts, and any outstanding liens and debts that might be on the land. So there's been some unfortunate cases around the country where people have inherited land, but the estate tax has been so heavy that they've actually had to sell parts or all of the land just to pay the the inheritance tax. So you don't want to have that happen to you. And so estate planning is a critical step in making sure that these inheritance transactions are as efficient as possible and with limited financial consequences to the beneficiaries. So a typical strategy might involve gradually transferring assets to family members through annual gifts. Also, you want to have a will in place that will simplify the probate process, which is about validating the will and distributing the assets. And other strategies for managing assets include establishing trusts, joint ownerships of assets, and even certain types of life insurance policies are helpful. So anyways, in any case, land ownership and potential landowners and potential beneficiaries should work with a trusted professional estate advisor to do their estate planning. This is definitely not a do-it-yourself kind of job. In tribal settings, Indian trust land, as I mentioned, requires special consideration and processes. So at a minimum, all Indian landowners should know how much land they own, where their land is, how much their share is worth, and how that land is being used and by whom. And so as part of the trust responsibility, the BIA's OST, Office of Special Trustee for American Indians, is going to be responsible for having all of that information. And so you need to work with them to deal with any sort of transactions involving Indian trust land. Here's a great resource if you've got trust land and you're looking to do something with it. It's found at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. It's called Cutting Through the Red Tape, an Indian Landowner's Guide to Reading and Processing Federal Forms. And you can find it at that website, or you can just Google Cutting Through the Red Tape Indian Land Tenure Foundation. It will walk you through a bunch of forms that you will probably need to do anything with the land. But as always, deal with your local tribal office because they'll have the most specific information for you. Okay, we're almost done. Let's take a quick quiz and see how we're doing. So true or false, whole farm planning is primarily concerned with profits and the financial well-being of the ag operation. True or false? Whole farm planning is primarily concerned with profits and financial well-being of the ag operation. Okay, so the answer is false. So most of you got that right. Remember, whole farm planning is a balanced, holistic approach. So it's going to look at financial well-being as one of many other things, including the family and the environment and so forth. All right, good job. Next question. Oh, I missed the last question. Let me see if I can get back here. Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry. Which of the following statements is correct regarding whole farm planning? It's a process that takes a holistic view of the farm and incorporates the needs of the business, family, community, and environment. It's often used in combination with a sustainable ag approach. It's the whole farm planning resource assessment identifies the strengths and weaknesses from all stakeholder perspectives. Or D, all of the above are correct. Okay, all of the above are correct. Most of you got that right. That's basically it. All of those items were true. So good job. All right. I think we are about done here. I'll open it up to questions. I kind of went through most of the hour here, so but we still have time for a few questions if you have any. If you do, just go ahead and throw something in the chat box. Okay, it looks like everyone's okay. I'm going to turn it back over to Linnell, but I want to thank everybody for your attention. And I think, Linnell, you'll probably make this PowerPoint available to the folks, I'm guessing. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact the folks at OISTA, and I'll be happy to support them in responding to you and making sure that you have your questions answered. So thanks again, appreciate it, and good luck in your endeavors.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I will be following up with everyone on the webinar today with the slides and a recording of the webinar and a quick survey of the presentation. Thank you all for joining us.
And thank you each for participating and spending a good hour with us. I hope the information you got is helpful. And I know a couple of the groups who are wanting to really push as part of their TA this year to get the Indian Ag classes going. So this is a good start to it. There's so much information. If you remember the book that we were presented at the ANA convening, there's a lot of information, so it's kind of narrowing it down to make it a little more manageable for our groups and our participants. So this is a wonderful start. So I appreciate the time, John. I appreciate the presentation and time you put into it. So definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. And like Stephanie said, we'll be following up with you guys via email. Thank you, and we'll talk with you soon.
Thank you.